Samuel. 1 Samuel chapter 4. If you don't own a Bible, we'd love to give you a Bible. We have a stack of Bibles back there. It's our gift from us to you as a welcome to our ministry. They're really nice Bibles. Write in it, highlight it. It tends to make the Bible a little bit more personal for you. And I don't know, it's great. Not that apps are bad or anything like that. I primarily study from my laptop and an app as well. But it's just something different about having a physical Bible. So if you don't have one, please take one. And you may notice that I have no pajamas at all, at all. That is my bad. I don't own pajamas. I don't at all. All I have is basketball. All I have is basketball shorts, and that's typically what I sleep in, is basketball shorts. And so my bad at all. And then shirtless, and I don't think y'all want to see that. That's a way to kill a ministry, is just show up shirtless on pajama day. No one will come back ever again. So I don't know about you. One of my favorite clips from The Office is when Michael Scott's like, hey, I'm not superstitious, I'm a little stitious. Right? That's me. I'm just a little stitious. Right? I have a few superstitions that I kind of hold on to. One of them, for example, and it's really silly and really dumb, but when I play basketball, I go through a motion to shoot a free throw. I got to go through the whole entire progression. I kind of dribble the ball a couple times, let it spin in my hand, come in, and then post up and shoot. It's a really silly superstition, but I do it. And I have a couple of other ones as well that I do. Maybe you have a superstition. Could be wearing your lucky socks on game day or test day, right? Maybe you follow a routine when you have a big event and you follow this routine to the T, because the moment you don't follow it, man, your day's going to go bad. It could be something like that. And overall, I would say, hey, some of these superstitions are fun. It's okay. There's nothing wrong or bad. I don't want to left turn and be like, hey, you're a sinner because you have, no, I'm not going to do anything like that. That's okay. But what I do want to talk about, something that kind of may seem superstitious is that when people do certain things, right, there's a certain pattern, a certain behavior, and typically within church settings and religious settings, that if you do these certain things, right, you believe you'll gain the upper hand, that God will give you an extra blessing, right, or will do something, right, because you prayed the right prayer. He's in heaven saying, yeah, wow, that prayer was awesome. Man, bravos, kudos. I love that. Because of that, here's an extra, $100 in your pocket that you lost, and now you found again. God's not up in heaven doing like that. And tonight, the reason I bring that up is because tonight we're entering our very first time a theme that we will see over and over in the book of Samuel. You will see this theme of outward action with a lack of inward devotion. And it'll be repeated over and over and over again as we study this book. The Israelites do it. King Saul's going to do it. King David's going to do it. And it's repeated over and over again. It's outward action with the lack of inward devotion. You do an action, but your heart is not in it. And here's an action that they're doing that on face value kind of seems a little superstitious. On face value, kind of seems like a religious thing that they're doing, but it truly lacks an inward devotion to God. But they do it because they believe God's going to bless them for it. And maybe that's you. You do certain things, right? And you believe God's going to bless you for it. And here, what we're going to read tonight, Israel gets superstitious, right? They got superstitious. And ultimately, by doing that, they didn't honor God like the way He had commanded them to honor God. They don't honor God, worship God like God had called them to worship. Which leads us, I think, for all of us tonight to really ask ourselves the question, do we honor God like we should? And that's what we're really going to navigate tonight. Do you honor God like the way you should? And if you don't, or maybe you do, or maybe you're curious about the thing, I think all our answers would be yeah, of course. Of course we should honor God. But I think according to the text and what we're going to look at today, there's 3 reasons why we should honor God. One is because God is God. Then my second point is going to be like this, because there is no other God. And that's why God deserves to be honored, because there is no other God besides him. And then lastly, because he demands it. He demands it. And so we're doing this new series called Heavy's the Head. It comes from the Shakespeare quote, Heavy's the head that wears a crown, which is this idea that the more leadership you get, more responsibility you get, the heavier that weight is. The decisions you make really make an impact. And here what we'll see is 3 different leaders that will take this small nation of Israel. They finally made it out of the wilderness. They finally made it through battling and fighting all these other countries, all these other villages, and to finally establish themselves as a kingdom. They exited a very dark time where people are getting chopped up, shipped all over the places. You had messed up leaders take over control, but ultimately provided some freedom. And they're finally coming out of that. And these 3 leaders we'll begin to kind of look at and glance at and how they lead. And this is, again, like I mentioned last week, we will see these leaders many times. We've heard of stories that come from 1 Samuel, the biggest one being David and Goliath. When you talk about any, especially like when you talk about the Super Bowl and things like that or sporting events, we'll always talk about the David and Goliath story. And it comes from the book of 1 Samuel. And technically, it's not 2 books. It's one giant book. But when you start adding vowels to the original language, it's got separated into 2 books because it was so big, it was so large of a volume. But ultimately, here we are introduced to Israel. Israel is the country that's being talked about and the country that's ultimately being led. And Israel here blamed all their issues and has been blaming their issues for the lack of a king. They don't have a king, but they desperately want a king. They see all the neighboring nations and they say, hey, that king thing that they got, it seems pretty cool. We will be respected, we will be loved, and people will care about us ultimately if we have a king. But all their issues truly was because of a lack of obedience. They didn't obey God. They didn't follow God. Ultimately, they were trying to gaslight the creator of the world, saying, hey, our issue is that we lack this king, instead of looking introspectively to themselves. And ultimately, this is to communicate their continual rebellion towards God, because he had a plan for them, and God ultimately was going to give them a king. He even writes about this. And so what we're beginning to look at is to see tonight how messed up Israel really is. And the way we look at that in the story we're going to trace, honestly, is written like a comedy. Like some of this should make you laugh. That if you read the Bible on your own, you read kind of these stories, like it is supposed to be funny. It's supposed to make you laugh. It's a really, truly funny story. But it regards the ark. Now, the ark, as we know, is the Ark of the Covenant. It's a special box with gold angels and things like that. But ultimately, it communicated, right, like Israel's connection with God and how they were supposed to worship him, connect with him, and enter their relationship with him. And Samuel loves to use this ark to communicate how close they truly are to God. Their relationship with God is going to be determined here through the ark. And we're going to see the ark appear, and then I'm going to say, hey, take a good look at it, because you're not going to see it appear for a very long time. It isn't until we enter 2 Samuel that you see it again, because ultimately it's going to communicate, hey, listen, Israel's that messed up that God is going to kind of back away. Is going to back away from them. And so here we're entering now. We're introduced to our main character. The character of the book was named after Samuel. We went from a position of no one ever hearing from God, no one having visions, to all of a sudden having frequent visions. There's visions now happening all the time. And now Samuel's communicating, talking to the people, because he is seeing and hearing God. So we start off with chapter 4, verse 1. And it said, "In the word of Samuel called to all of Israel." And now, and the word of Samuel called to all of Israel. Now Israel went out to battle against the Philistines, and they encamped at Ebenezer, and the Philistines encamped at Aphek. We're going to keep on rolling. We're just going to keep on saying these words, and may not know how to say them, but we're going to keep on rolling, pretend like we do. The Philistines drew up in the line against Israel, and the battle spread. And Israel was defeated before the Philistines, who killed about 4,000 men on the field of battle. And when the people came up to the camp, the elders of Israel said, why has the Lord defeated us today before the Philistines? Let us bring the ark of the covenant of the Lord here from Shiloh, that it may come alongside of us and save us from the power of our enemies. So the people went to Shiloh, and they brought from the ark, the ark of the covenant of the Lord of hosts, who is enthroned on the cherubim, and the two sons of Eli, remember those two wicked sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the ark of the covenant. So they got beat up. They got beat up. They're like, hey, we got a bright idea. Let's do what the Nazis did in Indiana Jones, and let's bring the ark with us, and we're going to defeat everybody. And that's what they really thought. The writers of Indiana Jones, George Lucas, should have read, Samuel. He would have been able to figure out that no, all because you have the ark, you don't always win. But they said, hey, we think we can win if we bring this ark out. And clearly there's stories where that happens. You see this in Joshua, the walls of Jericho. They walk with the ark around the town, and everything crumbles and everything falls. And there's other instances when they have the ark present that there is some type of battle there. But in reality, the ark was meant to communicate their relationship with them. God would sit present. The way God's imagery and the way that He's communicated is like they would create this little seat, and God would sit on top of the ark. And they would make sacrifices. And that's how God would be able to interact and communicate with His people. And this is ultimately to show, like, hey, God is with the people. He is walking with the people. He's abiding with the people. And then they're taking this thing that God has declared sacred to connect with them. They're taking this thing and basically disrespecting it. They're basically dishonoring it. And that's what we see in this text. The true relationship of what they saw, God was truly as a luck charm. They really didn't want to connect with God or worship God or be with Him at all. And ultimately they thought, like, hey, listen, if I do this action, God ultimately will bless me. That ultimately God is for me. There's a very famous theology called the prosperity gospel that's very similar to, I think, some of this action. That if I go in and go to church, throw my money into the plate, right? Say my certain prayers, behave a certain way. I will be blessed with health, or I'll be blessed with wealth, and I will be in a great position, and God will just take care of me. And while, yes, there's some truth that, listen, giving, like the Lord will bless you, the blessing doesn't necessarily mean financial blessing. Sometimes, man, He just blesses your heart and blesses your soul that you did the right thing, that you walked in obedience. But here, they said, hey, if we do this thing, we're going to go ahead and win. And all this does is completely dishonor God. So we were talking about then again tonight, we're talking about honoring God. And so then what does honoring mean? Well, here's a good definition that I found online. It's perceived value, to render or esteem glorious. That this thing is valuable. This thing right here is worth everything. And here Israel did not communicate that. They hadn't communicated that for a very long time. They just thought that, hey, we can roll this box out and we can beat our arch nemesis up. And that is furthest thing from the truth. They did not esteem, and nor did they value God, but if anything, they were trying to use God for their things, for their wanting. And so for us, we must be careful when we also take God's name in vain and we try to walk and do certain things, believing God's going to bless us because, you know what? Man, I go to church every Tuesday. I go to church every Sunday. Or, hey, because I read my Bible every day. And not that those things are bad or wrong, but when we believe that God's going to give us extra favor or extra blessing or do something special in our lives, and it's more now just to favor me, to what can be given to me, what can be handed to me. Hey, listen, guys, we're ultimately missing the point. Because God ultimately doesn't want us to just do things for the sake of doing them. But ultimately, these things are meant to create a relationship with Him. Like one of my favorite analogies of all this is from a pastor named John Piper. And he talks about like this idea of giving flowers to his wife. And so he talks about like, hey, he goes and as you can see there, like especially the Kroger parking lot there's like the big old tents and you go in, you buy the beautiful fresh flowers and let's just pretend I go in and buy some flowers for my wife, and I grab them, and I come home, and I open the door, and the kids are yelling and screaming. I'm like, everybody shut up. And then I walk to Michelle, and then I see Michelle, and I give her these flowers. And her eyes start welling up, and she gets super excited to see these flowers. And then she grabs them, and she goes, oh, honey, thank you. Like, why did you buy me these flowers? And what if I responded with, I was just driving by the Kroger, and I saw the tent, and it kind of hit me that we're close to Valentine's Day, and I realized that husbands are supposed to buy their wives flowers on Valentine's Day, so I just bought you these flowers for Valentine's Day just because that's what a husband's supposed to do. Like, how do you think Michelle would respond if that was my answer? Like, yeah, exactly. She like, all right, straight to the trash, don't want these at all. But what if my approach was radically different? What if my approach is like, hey, baby, because, like, man, I saw these flowers, and they couldn't compare to your beauty, to your worth, and what you mean to my life. All right, definitely she's going to put on the waterworks, and she's going to cry, and everything will be radically different. That ultimately, when we do things, they're meant to connect and build a relationship with God. They're not meant to be done out of duty. And that's something we got to begin to work out of our minds. Isaiah 55 will continually remind us that God's thoughts are not our thoughts. And I hate to say it, guys, like I know this sounds bad because I think a lot of the songs, the way that we sing them, we just got to be careful. We don't process them all, but truly we believe that God is for us. No, God is ultimately for God. And while, yes, God loves us and cares for us, and he gave his son for us to die on the cross, at the end of the day, God is for God. Which is a good thing for us, because if God is for us, ultimately, as Scripture says, who can ultimately be against us? And so Israel had to learn that hard lesson. They believed just rolling out this box would win them the war. And what ends up happening, they end up getting beat up. The prophecy that we saw last week, Hophni and Phinehas die. Eli hears this word. His heart is broken. And he, again, old blind guy, just sits down and just passes out. Cracks the back of his head and lies there dead. Here you have all three of them dead. But then there's a very interesting part that gets communicated in verse 19. He says, now his daughter-in-law, the wife of Phinehas, was pregnant, about to give birth. And when she heard the news that the ark of God was captured, and that her father-in-law and her husband were dead, they were all priests, she bowed and gave birth, for her pains came upon her. And about the time of her death, the woman attending her said to her, do not be afraid, for you have borne a son. But she did not answer or pay attention. And she named the child Ichabod, saying, the glory has departed from Israel, because the ark of God had been captured because of her father-in-law and her husband. And she said, the glory has departed from Israel, for the ark of God has been captured. Here she's communicating some deep truth. She's saying, hey, listen, God's glory is not here anymore. God's glory has left. And there's a part of that is true for Israel. They didn't honor him, so his glory, the feeling of his glory was not there anymore. And Eli and his family are removed from there. Worship, which was happening at Shiloh, no longer happens at Shiloh, and its loss is both political and spiritual. This is a big deal. This is the Ark of the Covenant. It'd be the, equivalent of me going to war and losing my wedding ring at war to the enemy. Like we bet on my wedding ring, and they win my wedding ring. This is awful. This is absolutely awful. And so here, the people lose hope. His glory is gone. They really, truly feel God is not with us anymore. His presence has left, and God is gone. We are now all left alone. Who's going to be for us? Who's going to fight for us? And this is also, I think, what we see, in many times with people that are going through hard times, when you're going through difficult times. I've seen it time and time again where people begin to think this way, that God has left them, that God has abandoned them, that God is not with them. And can I just remind you tonight, like we're about to enter this, like God has not left and God's not quiet. Again, we go through this little adventure with the Ark of the Covenant, and it does some pretty cool things. And just a reminder to all of us that God has not left you, God has not abandoned you, but God's still working and moving, and He has a plan. And we begin to see this plan here for the Israelites in chapter 5. When the Philistines captured the Ark of God, they brought it from Ebenezer to Ashdod. Then the Philistines took the Ark of God and brought it into the house of Dagon, and they set it up beside Dagon. And when the people of Ashdod rose early the next day, behold, Dagon had fallen face downward on the ground before the ark of the Lord. So they took Dagon and put him in his place. But when they rose early on the next morning, behold, Dagon had fallen face down on the ground before the ark of the Lord, and the head of Dagon and both his hands were lying cut on the threshold. Only the trunk of Dagon was left on him. This is why the priests of Dagon and all who enter the house of Dagon do not tread on the threshold of Dagon in Ashdod, still to this day. So the Philistines, ultimately, their belief, and just kind of give you some background here, belief, and this time the idea that when they would go to war, right, they would try to capture whatever symbol or whatever thing that represented their God, they would go ahead and capture that as well. Here, Israelites more than likely believe the same thing. This is why they're taking the ark out. It's a very kind of pagan mindset. It wasn't necessarily God's mindset. It was very much a pagan mindset. And so again, this is why they think the blessing is gone, that God is not with them. They truly believed, and at least the Philistines did, that God had been captured. But the reality is God is still very much present into this whole entire thing. You can't capture God. The idea is that the Philistines believe that you would be in the heavens, right? And you're going to war in the heavens, both the gods would begin to face off. That they would typically, again, the opposing armies coming this way, you're going this way, and then in heaven, like you're the gods, like you're essentially avatars for the God, and you're fighting on earth. And the God that's winning up in heaven will determine who's winning down on bottom, on earth. And so the Philistines clearly thought, we beat the Israelites, so Dagon must have beat up the God up in heaven. He must have completely messed them up. And so what they would do then is, again, bring in whatever type of like statue or idol that they would have, in this case, the ark, and they would go ahead and place it in the temple. And the reason why they would do that was just in case, like, right, our God just beat him up, but beat him up so bad like he just didn't kill him, right? And so that God can kind of heal himself and get himself better, right? Well, we don't want him to smite us by desecrating or messing up his, any kind of statue or anything that represents him. And so we want to be careful that we don't get smited for destroying or disrespecting that God. But again, in this case, God didn't get beaten at all. They take it into this temple, kind of saying, hey, we won. And they would more than likely put Dagon at a higher place and the Ark of the Covenant at a lower place. They're going to say, hey, our God beat their God. And God's like, nah. I'm going to show you right now that I didn't get whooped by no fish, God. And so what ends up happening is that they go into worship the next day into this temple, and there'd be the pantheons of all these other gods, more than likely all these other gods that the Philistines weren't beaten. And then there's Dagon laying face down, supposed to be the champion, laying face down towards the ark, bowing down. The idea is that he's bowing down towards the ark. So this kind of, like, could you imagine, like, you're walking in, like, early morning, you're walking in this really dark tent, right? And you kind of see some light, and the first thing you see is, like, this heavy statue that normally can't be moved. Just bow down. So your first reaction is like, well, this is probably just an accident. Cat came in, kind of knocked it over. Like this is fine. We're just going to set it back up. Well, they set it back up again, and it happens once again. But this time, it says that his hands were broken off and his head was cut off. Basically, God saying, hey, I defeated this God. There exists no other God above me. I am the greatest one. I am the champion. This God is completely defeated. See, where Israel treated God, ultimately superstitiously, you begin to see the Philistines, ultimately in the beginning, really treat God disrespectfully. What Israel was supposed to do, if they were supposed to follow the Old Testament, is that they were supposed to be a kingdom of priests. They were supposed to come into Israel. Was supposed to go into the Philistines and love them and care for them and show them that, hey, listen, Yahweh is God. Yahweh is superior than Dagon. Dagon makes you and requires you to sacrifice your children to him. Hey, the God of the Bible does not require that and demand that of you. Hey, Dagon requires and demands all these different acts of pagan worship. Hey, listen, the God of the Bible does not demand and does not require that of you. They were supposed to be the kingdom of the priests, this middle person, say, hey, broken and fallen Philistines, let me introduce you to this awesome and amazing God. But instead of being that to them, they quickly became enemies. One commentator put it like this, that the God's covenant with Israel had been instituted so that they could live in such a way as to indicate to the world who God was and what he was like. Instead, God communicated that message for himself. He's saying, hey, I'm the greatest, I'm the grandest, and your puny gods bow down and worship me. Yahweh's the true king, and he has defeated Dagon. No one could defeat him. Ultimately, God's letting them know, hey, listen, you didn't beat the Israelites. I beat the Israelites. I let them lose. You did not win. God will not be mocked or be belittled. And the reality is for Israel, again, they lost hope, but there was really truly no change. And we'll get to some of that here in a bit. There was no change in Israel and their mentality and their heart. But what you begin to see amongst the Philistines is you begin to see a change of heart. Part of it is, yes, God begins to curse them. All of a sudden, they start developing tumors all over their body, and it's really, really painful. And then on top of that, rats start coming out and start eating all their crops and things like that. And so they get freaked out. And so they're saying, hey, we want this thing out of here. And so they would give it to the next town saying, hey, we got a present for you. And they'd be like, geez, thanks. Like an awesome golden ark that, of the Israelite God. This is awesome. Thank you. And then the next town would start developing tumors and rats would come over and start eating all their stuff. And so they would give it to another town. And so this happened a couple of times. Again, it's supposed to be comical. Like, oh my gosh, do you not get what's happening here? And what they quickly realize, hey, listen, God is moving. This God thing is actually happening. We need to go ahead and treat this thing with a little bit more respect than we have been. It's kind of communicating like, hey, listen, the dirty, rotten pagans completely understood how to treat this ark better than the people who were supposed to know how to treat the ark. Hey, the pagans are actually living out their life accordingly, and we don't. The pagans actually know how to worship God, and we don't. And I think that sometimes happens to us in the church, that I think so many times there's certain things that the outside world does better than I think the church does. Man, I love Charles and when he's talking about the word about, again, not community, about family. But when I was thinking and writing the sermon, like the thing that came to me and kept on thinking about over and over again, it's like, man, listen, I think sometimes the outside world can be better at community than the church can. Like I was talking to a pastor the other day, and he was talking about like an old sermon quote that he really liked. And he was like, hey, there was a guy who was dealing with the situation, and he had two people to tell. Like, does he tell this one person who's like a rotten crook who just got out of jail, or does he tell this one person whose family's at a mess and disarray? And he asked this one person, like, who would you tell this dark secret to? And the guy says, like, I don't know between those two, but I can tell you who I definitely would not tell. I wouldn't tell a Christian. And I think that's kind of the sad reality is I think so many times the world does this a whole lot better than us. Here in the Philistines' case, man, they were honoring and respecting the ark. They were honoring and respecting God better than the Israelites. Man, what are those things that we as a church, man, we just kind of fail at every single time? And we just don't honor God correctly every single time we do this. Like, what is that thing? And the only thing that could hit me is community. There may be something else that you can kind of see that's a whole lot better, and maybe talk about that tonight in connection group or in small group. Because I think it's an important thing to talk about and discuss. That what are the places that the world, outside world, puts us to shame? Another area that I thought, man, just kind of hit me hard is like dating. I can't tell you the times that I've talked to a young lady, and specifically it's a young lady, and she'll come up to me and she'll be like, Sly, like I'm done dating dudes in the church. She's like, I'm just done. They're just as bad as dudes in the club. They're not good. They'll cheat on you, or they'll lie to you, or they don't treat you like the way a Christian should treat you. And I've seen it time and time again. And I'm like, yeah, homegirl, you're right. I mean, but don't date dudes in the club. Like, that doesn't give you the option to do that. But don't do that. But you're right. Maybe chill out with the guys in the church for a little bit. You'll eventually find the right guy who loves Jesus. But it happens that I think many times the world will put us to shame. Again, it could be community, it could be dating, but there's probably something more. There's more things. We as Christians, again, are supposed to be this kingdom of priests. Peter takes that same terminology that the Israelites were supposed to be. He takes that terminology and says, hey, Christian, that's what you are. You're a priest. You're my representative. You're supposed to represent Almighty, all-powerful, all-holy God to a broken and dying world. You stand in the middle and you connect and you bring them together. And that's what we're supposed to represent. We're supposed to represent Jesus to a broken and dying world. Israel was supposed to represent Jesus to a broken and dying world and show how he's supposed to be honored, and they didn't. So God did that for himself. He said, hey, listen, there is no other God like me, and I'll put him to shame. Which leads me to my last point. We honor God because he demands it. So again, it ends up in a really kind of funny situation. They decide to go ahead and get these cows and tie these cows to the ark. And they put the cows there, and they decided to go ahead and put a brand new cart because they realized, like, hey, wait a minute, like this God is a real thing. Like we got to treat this God with respect. So let's go ahead and build him a brand new like wagon. And then they're like, hey, because we're getting like these tumors all over the place, and we're seeing these mice. Let's create gold mice and gold tumors and put them in there as an offering to say, hey, we're sorry for taking you. But then you had some people that were still just a little bit worried saying, hey, I don't fully know if this is like the God of Israel or not. So let's do this. The cows that are going to lead this wagon, let's go ahead and put 2 cows that are nursing calves. And the idea is that when the baby calves would cry out, the nursing cows would be like, oh, wait a minute, we need to go to our children, we need to go to our babies and go find them. So they were trying to set this thing up to fail. And it didn't. These cows said, nope, we know where we're going. And so they go back to Israel, and they're tracking it, and they're watching it. And like I mentioned earlier, the Israelites should have learned like how to respect God and how to worship God and how to do all that, but they didn't. Verse 19 says, and he struck some of the men of Beth Shemesh because they looked upon the ark of the Lord. He struck the 70 men of them, and the people mourned because the Lord had struck the people with a great blow. God had given the people, hey, this is how you worship me. This is how you interact with the stuff in the temple. This is how you interact with the ark. And the first thing happens when the ark comes back is like, nope, we're going to completely disrespect this thing. We're going to go ahead and mess with this thing. Let's go peek inside. Hey, you want to come and look inside as well? And they start messing with the ark in the way they shouldn't mess with the ark, and they all die. And the people start crying, and they start mourning, and it completely messes with them. Why? Because God gave them the instructions. Hey, this is how you honor me. And they didn't. They didn't do that. They continued to have the superstitious kind of behavior with the ark. And they ultimately decided to treat the ark and continue to treat like the ark as kind of a trophy to show off instead of showing the ark the respect it deserved. Because the ark was truly a symbol of God's holiness. And so God there begins to humble them and begin to humble the people there in that area. God has come back. Hope is being restored now to Israel, but it's looking different. It's no longer in the same city as it once was. It's kind of a little bit of a disarray because the family that was supposed to take care of the ark, they're all dead. Now a new family has to come in and take care of the ark. Still a Levi family, but the part of the Levitical family is a little bit different. It was to show that, listen, ultimately for them, there's this happiness, there's this glee. And it's a reminder to us that ultimately our happiness and our joy comes from the Lord, that that's where our hope comes from. It comes from God's power. But God begins to move and God begins to work. But again, they're not worshiping right. So it kind of same thing. It's moving to different cities. But I like verse 7. Chapter 7, verse 1. And the men of Kiriath Jearim came and took up the ark of the Lord and brought it to the house of Abinadab on the hill. And they consecrated the son of Eleazar to have charge of the ark of the Lord. And from that day that the ark was lodged at Kiriath Jearim, a long time passed, some 20 years, and all the house of Israel lamented after the Lord. Right worship started happening again. They lamented. Basically means they cried over their sins. They began to realize, like, hey, God, this is how we were wrong. This is how we messed up. And they began to lament, saying, we messed up, Lord. Will you please forgive us? And that's a reminder for all of us here tonight that when we sin, we are to lament over our sins. When we did our Sermon on the Mount series, we talked about that. Like, man, blessed are the brokenhearted, for theirs is the kingdom. Like there is something to us that when we begin to realize how we mess up and we begin to seek God and begin to pray to God and say, God, begin to work, begin to move, like God hears that and God honors that. So here you have finally a town that says, hey, we've messed up. Let's do this thing the right way, all right? And they get the right priest. They get a right priest to come in to take care of the ark and watch over the ark and handle the ark. And then from there that the ark has returned, they're saying, hey, Lord, we have messed up. We have sinned. Can you please forgive us? And this is years in the making. Like, again, if you read the book of Judges, like, yeah, y'all need to be lamenting for a long time. Like a long time. There's a lot that you need to repent of. There's a lot of things that you need to ask God for forgiveness. But you know what? God then begins to take care of them. The moment that happens and they lament and right worship enters into the house, into the country, they begin to be attacked. And you know what happens? Like they're being attacked, but in the midst of worship, like they're not defeated. Like everything's getting beat up, everything's being messed up, but because they're actually honoring God and doing like the way that God has commanded them, what do you know? Things begin to work out in their favor. They win the battle, and they didn't even have to fight. Matthew 6:33 puts it like this. He says, seek first the kingdom of God, and the rest of these things will be handed to you. That when you begin to seek God and look to God, lament over your sin and pursue Him, man, things just begin to fall in place. And I think this is important, again, as all y'all guys are young adults and beginning to start adulthood and beginning to do life. Like, listen, you will have different messages telling you, hey, put your attention on this, put your focus on this, do all these different things, and listen, if you do this, like, you'll get ahead in life. But there's this biblical truth saying, hey, listen, honor God and pursue God. And listen, things will really work out in your favor. Does it mean that you'll be a millionaire by your 40? Probably not. Maybe. I don't know. I don't know what the Lord has for your life. Did it mean that every single relationship you'll get in, right, you'll be able to network or move up in the corporate ladder? Maybe, maybe not. But here's the thing, like, are you putting the right value on God and honoring Him like the way you should? Like, have you placed the proper value? Like, one of my favorite shows is like Pawn Stars, right? And they'll come in with like this, I don't know, expensive samurai sword that's like beheaded, you know, thousands of people for multiple generations. And they're like, hey, like my grandpa got this at World War II. And, you know, it was one of his favorite things. And this was awesome. And we've had it for our family for a while. And can I sell it? And the guy's like, man, listen, the best I can give you is like $5. They're like, $5? Like, really? And like, yeah, that's the best we can do. He's like, all right, fine. And they'll just sell it for $5. And then they'll bring like a samurai expert, and he comes in, he checks up, and he breaks apart the sword and things like that. And they're like, wait a minute now, like this sword is like worth like, I don't know, like $2 million. They're like, oh, sweet, we bought it for $5. And I'm always like, I'm watching like, why? Like, don't sell it for that. I debate a lot with my TV when I'm really passionate about some of my shows. And I get passionate because like, yo, like this thing had so much value and you let it go for next to nothing. It's why? Because they didn't value it like the way they should have. And that's, I think, with us, like we don't value God like we should. And so why do we struggle with the sins that we always struggle with? Why do we wrestle with the things that we always wrestle with? It's because we are not honoring God the way we should, because we don't value him like we should. So it leads me to begin to wonder, like, okay, then how do we begin to honor God? Like, how do we begin to see him as beautiful, as wonderful as he truly is? Which I think leads me to the question that I think is so important, and I think this is what we're going to end with tonight, is like, man, do you have a relationship with him? Like, do you have a relationship with God? Like, I start thinking about like my life in ministry, right? And doing ministry as long as I have. And there was a couple times that we would have like these retreats, leadership retreats, and I'd bring all my leaders together and we would rent a lake house like up in Austin or something, somewhere nice. And we would do this, and then we would decide to do, just like, because I don't know, I'm a glutton for punishment, and we were all gluttons for punishment. We would do this thing where we'd say, hey, like what's one thing you can improve on, or one thing that we notice like, hey, you need to improve on. Hey, but what's one thing that, man, like that's awesome that you do? And you'd figure that everybody would cry on like, what's that one thing you need to improve on? Because like no one likes criticism. But every single time, man, it would be that thing. It's like, hey, man, these are the things that you're doing right, that I see in you, that are awesome, and I just want to call it out. And it always would be like a night where there'd be a lot of weeping, a lot of crying. Because, man, it's kind of people saying like, hey, like I see this in you, and this is awesome. And I know for me, those nights would mess me up. And I'm not trying to portray myself as like this, heroic figure or this Jesus figure or anything like that. Please don't take me like that. I mess up, and I mess up a lot. But when it comes to me and people would come up to me and say, hey, Sly, like, man, listen, dog, I love you because this, and this. And I mean, they start crying, I start crying. And I go to the next person's life, man, I look at you, and I love when you do this, and this. Man, it just makes me feel loved and things like that. And man, I would cry and they would cry. And as I was writing this sermon, I started thinking about those moments. And I still think about those relationships. And like I know still to this day, like if I call those people and say, hey, like I'm an idiot, I decided to sell the house, and I'm going to move everything from this 2-story house, and we're going to move to a third floor of an apartment complex. Are you down to help? Like these are the people that would say, how many? 3 stories? Three flights of stairs? Oh, yeah, I'll do it for you. But dang it, Sly, quit moving. And they would come in and they would help, and they would move down two flights of stairs house and move into 3 flights of apartments, and they would do it. Why? They would honor me because I love them and they love me. Because there's a relationship there. There's a relationship built. Then I began to think about Jesus. And again, I'm not trying to make myself like Jesus or anything like that at all. But it's kind of, for me, it just kind of hit me. Like, think about these disciples. They ate with him. They fished with him. They walked, they saw him walk on water. They saw him heal. They were doing life with them. They had a relationship with him. A deep, intimate relationship with him. That when you look back to church history, 10 of them died a martyr's death. They honored him. Did they mess up? Absolutely. But they saw the value of the Savior. They saw how beautiful and how worthy he is. They valued that because there was a relationship there. So here's my question. Do you have a relationship with Jesus? And I know for most people say, oh, yeah, I have a relationship. It's about religion. It's about relationship, not religion. Sly, like, I got that one. Like, I get that. And I'm glad you know the platitudes and the little words and the phrases. I'm glad you know that. But here's the question. Do you truly have a relationship with him? That when you wake up in the morning, the first thing you want to do is dive into this, not because you have to do it out of a duty so God can bless you, but you're doing this because, man, you just want to connect with him. That when you wake up, man, you just want to pray because you can't start your day without having a conversation with the Savior of the world, that he desires to speak to you, talk to you. Do you have a relationship with him? And if you don't, man, I'm going to be back there in the back, and I would love to talk to you about it. And if you have had at one point, but man, you have gone distant, you haven't communicated with them, you haven't talked to them in a while, hey, I would love to pray for you in the back. And if you don't talk to me, don't worry. It's like we're going to have some time in group, and it'll be a good time to talk about that and discuss all that. But I don't want you to leave tonight without understanding the value and worth of Jesus. Israel didn't get it, and they hurt. And here's the secret. Spoiler alert, Saul doesn't get it, and he's their first king. And then you have this new king that comes up by the name of David. He's a man after God's own heart. And guess what happens to David? He doesn't value God like he should, and he messes up. It messes up pretty bad. But it's all to point to a future king who comes in, who loves you, who cares for you, wants to have a relationship with you, and died for you on the cross. Let's pray. So, Lord, we want to thank you for this time. We want to thank you for this moment, just to be able to reflect on your goodness and your greatness. God, that even when Israel messes up, God, we are Israel, we mess up. And God, the hope doesn't have to be lost. God, you're still working in the background. You're still greater than all gods. God, and then you come back into our lives to show us, hey, I'm still here. We can still have hope. So God, I pray that in turn we see you as beautiful, as magnificent, as wonderful, and we truly value you for who you are, the almighty, all-powerful creator, but on top of that, the lover of our soul. And that was displayed on a criminal's cross. So God, we love you and we thank you, and all these things we ask in the name of Jesus Christ.